There is a prison that has no bars. It has no concrete walls nor iron chains. You were not placed in it by a judge nor by a declared enemy. You entered it on your own accord, and worse, you continue choosing to stay. This prison has a name. Carl Jung called it psychic heteronomy, the state in which your life is not driven by you, but by the expectations, reactions, and judgments of others. Think about this for a moment. How many decisions did you make today that were, to some extent, shaped by what someone else would think of you? How many words did you swallow just to avoid displeasing someone? How many versions of yourself have you already presented to the world? Not because they were true, but because they were safe. Most people answer these questions with discomfort. And this discomfort is the very first crack in the prison wall. Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who revolutionized our understanding of the human mind in the 20th century, dedicated decades to understanding why intelligent, capable, and conscious human beings continue to live as puppets of other people's opinions. He did not find the answer in moral weakness. He found it in the depths of the unconscious, in a mechanism that begins in childhood, solidifies in adolescence, and, if left unconfronted, silently governs the entirety of adult life. What you are about to learn is not a series of social tricks. It is not a list of positive affirmations to repeat in front of the mirror. What Jung discovered goes much deeper, and for that reason, it is much harder to face. Throughout this video, we will dissect the fundamental psychological principles that keep people trapped under external control. We will study historical cases where these mechanisms determined the fate of real men and women. And by the end, you will hold a map in your hands, not to manipulate others, but to reclaim what was always yours, sovereignty over your own mind. Prepare yourself. Because what Jung discovered about human nature is not comfortable, but it is liberating. Principle I, the mask that devours the face. The persona and the invisible cost of approval. Jung identified that every human being builds, throughout life, a psychic structure he called the persona, from the Latin word for the mask worn by actors in ancient Greek theater. The persona is the collective set of roles we play for the world: the competent professional, the obedient child, the always available friend, the patient partner. In itself, the persona is not pathological. It is necessary. No human being survives in society without some capacity for social adaptation. The problem begins when the mask grows too large, when the persona becomes so elaborate, so constantly reinforced by external approval, that the individual no longer knows where the mask ends and the true self begins. That is the exact moment external control establishes itself permanently. Because now any threat to the mask is felt as a threat to one's very existence. Why is this mechanism so universal? Because it begins before we even have the words to describe it. A child learns very early on that certain behaviors bring approval and others bring rejection. Excessive crying bothers people. Aggressiveness scares them. Deep sadness discomforts the adults around. Thus, gradually, the child learns to archive these parts of themselves, to push them into the shadow, and to present to the world only what is accepted, praised, and rewarded. Jung wrote, "The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society, fittingly a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other, to conceal the true nature of the individual. The result of this process, when taken to the extreme, is a personality that operates entirely in a reactive mode. Every action is a response to what others expect. Every choice is filtered through the imaginary verdict of an invisible audience. The person becomes, in Jung's own words, an echo of others' voices. There is a historical case that illustrates this tension with surgical precision, and it comes from one of the most powerful men in Western history. Marcus Aurelius became Emperor of Rome in 161 AD, not because he desired the throne, but because destiny and Emperor Hadrian ordained it. From childhood, he was trained to embody the persona of the ideal ruler, just, impassive, magnanimous. The Stoics who educated him reinforced this mask with philosophy. What few know is that Marcus Aurelius's private writings, the Meditations, a diary never intended for publication, reveal a man in constant conflict with this persona. He writes to himself about the fear of becoming nothing more than the role he plays. He reminds himself repeatedly that he is a man before he is an emperor. Do not waste the remainder of thy life in thoughts about others. Look within. Within is the fountain of good. Marcus Aurelius understood what Jung would take 18 centuries to formalize, that the persona, when left unexamined, consumes the being that dwells beneath it. He survived psychically because he had the discipline to maintain this internal dialogue, to remember, every single day, that there was a man behind the emperor. Most people do not have this dialogue, and so the mask wins. In the modern world, the persona has found its most fertile environment of all time: social media. The profile you curate, the photos you choose, the opinions you express publicly, all of this is persona. And the mechanics of likes, comments, and followers have created a system of continuous real-time approval feedback, far more powerful than any audience Jung could have ever imagined. The result? An entire generation learning to calibrate their identity based on digital engagement. Professionals who change their opinions when a post underperforms. Relationships manage to look happy in photos. Career decisions made based on what will look good on LinkedIn. The digital persona has devoured the faces of millions of people, and they haven't even noticed. First, establish a practice of private identity. Dedicate regular time. It could be journaling, it could be meditation, where you exist without an audience. A space where no decision needs to be justified to anyone. This is not isolation, it is psychic hygiene. Second, when you are about to make an important decision, ask yourself this question: would I still do this if no one ever found out? If the answer changes significantly, you are being governed by the persona, not by yourself. Principle 2, the shadow that others trigger. Why certain people hold absolute power over your emotions. There is a specific reason why certain people can unbalance you with a single sentence. It is because they are not touching you. They are touching something you have hidden from yourself. Jung called this repository of rejected parts of the personality the shadow, the unconscious side where reside the aspects of ourselves that we consider unacceptable, shameful, or dangerous. The shadow does not disappear when we ignore it. It grows stronger. And the clearest symptom of its presence is disproportionate emotional reactivity. When someone provokes a rage in you that seems far too large for the situation, that is the shadow. Speaking, Jung was precise regarding this mechanism. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. When someone displays arrogance and it perturbs you deeply, the Jungian question is not, why is this person arrogant? The question is, what is my relationship with arrogance? Where have I repressed it within myself? Where do I fear it exists in me? This process is called projection. We project onto others the qualities that we fail to integrate within ourselves, both the negative and, surprisingly, the positive ones. The man who feels deep anger at another's success is often projecting his own unfulfilled ambition. The person who feels constantly diminished by others' opinions often harbors an inner critic, far more severe than any external critic. External control, in this sense, is not exercised by others. It is exercised by your own unintegrated shadow, which uses other people as puppets to communicate with you. Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, who declared the death of God and proclaimed the ideal of the Übermensch, the Overman, spent the final years of his lucid life in a state of progressive mental collapse. But before that, he left in his diaries and letters a fascinating testimony of a man at war with his own shadow. Nietzsche preached the overcoming of oneself. He wrote about the will to power, the necessity of moving beyond resentment, and the danger of letting others define your worth. Yet at the same time, he was consumed by a desperate need for recognition. He sent his books to philosophers and intellectuals, waiting for responses that rarely came. He broke off friendships with Wagner, with his sister, with colleagues, in outbursts that he himself described as incomprehensible. Nietzsche wrote about the psychology of resentment in others with a clinical clarity that Jung greatly admired. But he failed to apply the diagnosis to himself. This is the tragedy of the unintegrated shadow. You can be capable of describing it perfectly in others while remaining completely blind to it within yourself. Nietzsche died intellectually isolated, largely because the people who tried to approach him triggered within him exactly what he refused to integrate: the need to belong, to be accepted, to not be alone. In the workplace, the shadow manifests with peculiar clarity. The manager who explodes disproportionately when a subordinate makes a minor mistake is usually projecting their own internalized self-criticism. The colleague who sabotages others' projects is frequently fighting their own repressed ambition. The person who feels constantly manipulated in relationships often harbors within their shadow the very same manipulative tendencies they refuse to acknowledge. Recognizing this is not self-flagellation. It is the beginning of immunity, because when you integrate the shadow, when you recognize within yourself the qualities you use to project onto others, the control those people had over you simply evaporates. There is no longer a hook. There is no longer a conduit for your reactivity. First, keep a record of your intense emotional reactions. Do not focus on what happened. Focus on what you felt and what specific quality in the other person triggered that feeling. Over time, a pattern will emerge. This pattern is the map of your shadow. Second, when you feel intense anger or contempt for someone, pause before reacting and ask, what exists in this person that I refuse to see in myself? Not to justify their behavior, but to reclaim the power you are yielding to your own reactivity. Principal thread: the parental complex and the invisible chains. How childhood still governs your adult decisions. There is a special category of control, deeper than social approval, more primitive than the projection of the shadow, which Jung called the parental complex. It is the collection of emotional patterns, beliefs, and automatic behaviors formed in our relationships with the primary authority figures of our childhood. The parental complex is not a memory. It is a grammar, an underlying structure that determines how you relate to authority, how you react to criticism, how much space you believe you deserve to occupy in the world, and how much control you allow others to exert over you. Jung was explicit. No one can mature psychologically who continues to ascribe responsibility for his internal state to others. The parental complex operates through a mechanism called transference, the unconscious tendency to project onto adult authority figures, bosses, spouses, mentors, the emotional patterns established with our parents. The child who learned that love is conditional, that they are only accepted when they perform adequately, becomes the adult who submits to any figure promising approval. The child who was constantly dominated by a controlling parent develops a hypersensitivity to authority that can manifest either as total submission or automatic rebellion, both of which are forms of external control. That transference is not conscious. You do not think, this boss reminds me of my father. You simply feel in front of certain people an anxiety or a dependency that seems entirely disproportionate. That is the complex speaking. Eleanor Roosevelt was born in 1884 into an aristocratic American family and spent the first years of her life believing she was fundamentally inadequate. Her mother called her Granny due to her serious and plain appearance. Her father, whom she adored, was an alcoholic whose presence in her life was irregular and unpredictable. Orphaned by age 10, she was raised by a cold and distant grandmother. The result was a young woman who walked into a room feeling automatically smaller than everyone else present. When she married Franklin Roosevelt, the pattern deepened. She lived in the shadow of a dominant mother-in-law and a husband who conducted his political life without including her. The turning point came when she was in her early 40s and discovered Franklin's infidelity. Instead of collapsing into the familiar family pattern of submission, Eleanor made what Jung would describe as the fundamental movement of individuation. She stopped seeking the approval of those who had historically controlled her and began building an identity based on her own values. What emerged was one of the most independent and courageous political voices of the 20th century. Eleanor Roosevelt became an author, columnist, civil rights activist, and later the chairperson of the UN Commission on Human Rights. Not because she received validation, but because she stopped waiting for it. She famously said, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." This phrase is, in Jungian terms, the precise description of what happens when the parental complex is confronted and integrated. In romantic relationships, the parental complex is the invisible director of more drama than any other psychological factor. The person who repeats dysfunctional relationship patterns, who finds themselves repeatedly drawn to the same dynamics of control or abandonment, is, most of the time, unconsciously reenacting the script of the parental complex. The same occurs in the professional environment. The inability to speak up in meetings, the difficulty in charging what your work is worth, the tendency to apologize for occupying space, paralysis in the face of criticism. These behaviors rarely originate from the present situation. They originate from unconscious decisions made decades ago by a child who needed to survive in an environment they did not control. First, identify which current authority figure triggers a disproportionate emotional load within you. Do not analyze the other person, analyze the pattern. Ask yourself, is this feeling old or new? Frequently, the answer reveals its ancient origin. Second, Jung maintained that the process of individuation requires that, at some point, every person must symbolically and psychologically separate from their parents, not with anger, but with consciousness. This means ceasing to seek the approval that will never come from those historical sources and beginning to construct an internal authority of your own. Up to this point, we have laid the foundation. You have learned that the persona, the social mask that builds your image, becomes a prison when you forget that a face exists beneath it. You have learned that the unintegrated shadow turns the people around you into involuntary triggers, ceding to them a power they should never hold. And you have learned that the parental complex operates as an invisible script, repeating the authority patterns of your childhood in your adult relationships. These three principles form the anatomy of external control. They are the roots, but roots on their own do not explain everything, because there is something beyond passive mechanisms, beyond masks, shadows, and complexes. There is an active dimension of control, where certain people have learned to use the psychology of others with surgical precision, where manipulation is not accidental but architected, where the battlefield is neither the office nor the relationship, it is your very identity. The next laws enter this territory. They are subtler, more dangerous, and harder to recognize precisely because they attack from within. If the first parts were about what you built that imprisons you, what follows is about what others build around you, and how to dissolve it. Principle 4. Identity as a battlefield. How sophisticated control operates through narrative viewer. Most advanced form of control does not use force. It does not use open threats. It uses something far more powerful, narrative. Whoever controls the story you tell about yourself controls you more effectively than any physical coercion. Jung identified this mechanism through the concept of introjection, the process by which we absorb, as if they were our own, the narratives that others construct about us. The man who was repeatedly called irresponsible in childhood and grows up believing he is unreliable. The woman who was described as too intense and spent decades minimizing her emotions so as not to displease. The professional who was passed over once and absorbed the narrative that they are not good enough. None of these judgments were facts. They were narratives. But by being introjected without critical examination, they became the lens through which these people interpret all subsequent experience. Jung wrote about the numinous power of words, about how certain statements, especially when uttered by authority figures in moments of emotional vulnerability, engrave themselves into the unconscious with a permanence that conscious logic rarely manages to erase. This explains a phenomenon that any attentive observer recognizes. Objectively talented people who behave as if they were mediocre, people with genuine emotional resources who submit to relationships that diminish them. The explanation does not lie in a lack of capacity. It lies in the introjected narrative operating below the threshold of consciousness. The sophisticated controller understands this intuitively. Therefore, they do not attack your actions, they attack your identity. I've always been like this. That's your problem. Any normal person wouldn't react this way. Each of these phrases is an attempt to fix a narrative about who you are and who you have no right to. Viktor Frankl was a young Viennese psychiatrist. When he was deported to Auschwitz in 1944, he lost his wife, his parents, his brother. He was subjected to conditions systematically designed to destroy human identity: forced labor, starvation, humiliation, the deprivation of his very name. What the Nazis understood, and applied with a bureaucratic coldness that still paralyzes us today, is that the destruction of identity precedes the destruction of the body. By replacing names with numbers, by standardizing clothes, by eliminating any possibility of choice, the system sought to implant a total narrative. You are not a subject. You are an object. Frankl refused, not in the form of physical resistance, that would have been suicide, but in something the guards could not control, the narrative he maintained about himself in his inner space. He remained to himself a doctor, a husband, a thinker, a man with a life's work to complete. In Man's Search for Meaning, he wrote, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." This is the Jungian response to the tactic of the imposed narrative, the deliberate, daily construction of an internal narrative that does not depend on external validation to sustain itself. In close relationships, whether romantic, familial, or professional, the tactic of the imposed narrative is frequently used by people who often have no full awareness of what they are doing. The partner who constantly reframes your experiences: "You're exaggerating. That didn't happen that way." Everyone acts like this. The problem is your sensitivity. This is what contemporary psychology calls gaslighting, and Jung would say it is, in more precise terms, an attempt to colonize another person's internal narrative space. First, develop the habit of examining the narratives you carry about yourself with the same skepticism you would apply to any factual claim. Where did this belief come from? Who said it first? Did they have an interest in you believing that narrative? Second, build what Jung called a psychic center of gravity of your own, a set of values, capacities, and experiences that you recognize as yours, independent of validation. Not out of arrogance. As a foundation, principle phi, psychic energy and the discipline of attention. Where you place your mind, you place your power. Jung conceived the psyche as an energetic system. Psychic libido, distinct from the strictly sexual Freudian concept, was for him the vital energy that fuels all mental and emotional activity. And like all forms of energy, it obeys a fundamental law. It is finite and it flows wherever attention is directed. Every unexamined emotional reaction is a transfer of energy. Every time you defend yourself against a criticism that doesn't deserve your attention, every time you engage in a conflict that does not nourish you, every time you seek approval from someone incapable of offering it, you are spending psychic libido on investments with a negative return. The controller does not need to dominate you directly. They only need to hold your attention, because where your attention is, there is your power. And where your power is, there is your identity. Jung wrote that the greatest problem his patients faced was not the absence of internal resources, it was the misdirection of those resources. Emotionally depleted people were not necessarily people who had faced too much. They were people who had reacted too much, who had wasted psychic libido in battles they did not consciously choose. He identified that chronic reactivity, the state of someone who spends their day responding to provocations, managing others' perceptions, and trying to control how they are seen, creates a state of exhaustion that undermines the capacity for individuation. You cannot build who you are while you are constantly defending who others say you are. Freedom, in this sense, does not begin with a dramatic action. It begins with a strategic withdrawal of attention, with the deliberate redirection of psychic energy from the fields where others consume it to the fields where it serves your own construction. Nikola Tesla was, by any objective measure, one of the most extraordinary intellects of the 19th and early 20th centuries. His contributions to alternating current radio and countless other technologies shaped the modern world in ways that are still underappreciated today. And yet, the last 30 years of his life were marked by growing poverty, progressive isolation, and a constant battle with Thomas Edison, with Guglielmo Marconi, with investors, and with the press. Tesla spent an extraordinary amount of his psychic energy in conflicts over recognition. While Edison, psychologically more shielded, less reactive to injustices, continued building his empire, Tesla consumed himself in battles for the credit that had been stolen from him. Not because he was wrong, he was right in most of these disputes, but because the reactivity drained the very energy that could have been directed toward invention. The biographer W. Bernard Carlson observed that Tesla, in his most productive phase, was capable of an almost superhuman concentration, able to work on complex problems for hours without interruption. But when the battle for recognition began, that capacity for concentration was fragmented. His attention was elsewhere, and with it, his creative power. Jung would say Tesla was a genius who never completely separated his internal worth from external validation. And this dependency left him vulnerable to a control he never recognized as such. In the contemporary world, the attention economy was designed specifically to exploit this mechanism. Every notification, every viral controversy, every cycle of outrage on social media is a suction device for psychic libido, a mechanism that converts your attention into profit for others while leaving you emotionally drained and psychically impoverished. The discipline of attention is not passivity. It is the conscious selection of where your energy goes. It is the ability to observe a provocation without feeling obligated to respond to it, to see a criticism without the urgency to refute it, to exist in the face of another's disapproval without collapsing. First, regularly audit where your psychic energy is being invested. List the conflicts, worries, and quests for approval that consume your attention. For each one, ask, does this investment bring me closer to who I want to be, or does it keep me in the orbit of who others want me to be? Second, practice what Jung would call a conscious strategic retreat, the ability to not react immediately to emotional provocations, not because you are indifferent, but because you choose the battlefield and the timing of every encounter. Deliberate silence is not weakness. It is the most advanced form of psychic sovereignty. Principle 6. Individuation as a political act. Becoming yourself is the greatest act of resistance. We have arrived at the deepest and most misunderstood principle of all Jungian psychology, applied to the theme of external control, individuation, the process by which a person becomes, in Jung's phrase, who they uniquely and truly are, is not a self-help project. It is not a journey of personal well-being. It is, in its most precise terms, an act of resistance against the most fundamental tendency of collective life, the pressure for the individual to dissolve their uniqueness into the mass. Jung wrote, "Society expects, and indeed must expect, every individual to play the part assigned to him as perfectly as possible. But anyone who does this exclusively is neglecting his own real nature." Elsewhere, he noted that nothing irritates people more than distinctiveness and uniqueness. Jung observed, over decades of clinical practice, that the individuals who suffered most from external control were not necessarily the psychologically weakest. Frequently, they were the most unique, those who carried something genuine that the surrounding social environment did not know how to receive. The pressure to conform does not present itself, most of the time, as open coercion. It presents itself as conditional affection, as threatened belonging, as the withdrawal of human warmth when you deviate from the expected script. It is the most sophisticated form of control because it uses what we desire most, connection, belonging, love, as an instrument of domestication. The Jungian response is not cynicism. It is not the rejection of love or community. It is the construction of a self sufficiently solid so that belonging becomes a choice, not a survival necessity, so that you can love without losing yourself, so that disapproval becomes tolerable, not because you do not care about others, but because your sense of identity does not depend on being approved by them. There is a profound irony in the fact that the greatest example of individuation in the history of analytical psychology is Jung himself, and that this example involves a break with the man he most admired. Around 1912, Jung was Sigmund Freud's designated heir. He was the president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. He was the intellectual son Freud had chosen to carry and expand his legacy. The pressure to continue in this role was immense, not just externally but internally. Jung genuinely admired Freud. To disagree with him was to disagree with someone to whom he owed a great deal, and yet, Jung identified within himself theories and experiences that simply would not fit within the Freudian framework. The spiritual dimension of the psyche, the importance of the collective unconscious, the nature of the libido as a vital energy broader than sexuality. When he published Symbols of Transformation in 1912, he knew the rupture was inevitable. Freud withdrew his friendship. The psychoanalytic community, for the most part, closed its doors to him. Jung spent the following years in a state he himself described as a confrontation with the unconscious, a period of isolation and disorientation that could easily have become a collapse. It did not become one. Because Jung had done the work he prescribed for his patients. He had built an internal center of gravity that did not depend on the approval of any authority figure, not even the one he admired most. What emerged from this period was the entirety of the Jungian system, the theory of archetypes, the collective unconscious, the shadow, the persona, individuation, one of the richest contributions to the understanding of the human psyche in the history of Western thought. It would not have existed had Jung yielded to the pressure to be what Freud needed him to be. Jung's lesson is not that you must break with everyone who limits you. It is that individuation, the process of genuinely becoming yourself, will inevitably generate resistance. And that this resistance is not a sign that you are wrong. Frequently, it is the clearest sign that you are on the right path. The people around you have an investment in the version of you they already know, the predictable, manageable version that occupies the role they assigned to you. When you begin to change, when you begin to express needs you previously suppressed, to refuse demands you previously accepted automatically, to occupy spaces you previously avoided, the system around you will react. This is not malice. It is homeostasis. Systems resist change. Your task is not to make them accept the change. Your task is to complete it. First, identify an aspect of who you are that you consistently minimize, hide, or deny for the sake of others' comfort. Do not expose it aggressively to the world. Acknowledge it in private first. Stop being an accomplice to external control by policing yourself on their behalf. Second, remember Jung's observation about the collective shadow. That genuine uniqueness irritates. Therefore, when your authenticity generates discomfort in others, consider the possibility that this is not a defect to be corrected, but a sign that you are, finally, ceasing to be an echo. We have reached the end of this journey, but not the end of the work. Because the work Jung described has no end. It is the work of a lifetime. Recapitulate for a moment. What has been revealed here? You have learned that the persona, the mask that society rewards, becomes a cage when you stop knowing that a face exists beneath it. That the shadow, the repository of everything you rejected in yourself, turns others into ghosts that haunt you with your own material. That the parental complex, the script written in childhood, continues directing the play of your adult life unless you consciously examine and rewrite it. You have learned that sophisticated control does not use force. It uses narrative. That whoever controls the story you tell about yourself governs you more completely than any tyrant. And that your psychic energy, your attention, your reactivity, your capacity for emotional response is a currency that can be spent either on construction or on constant defense. And you have learned, finally, that individuation and the process of becoming who you genuinely are is not a luxury for those with free time. It is the only real answer to external control, because you cannot be controlled by that which is fully integrated. There is no hook in an identity that does not need approval to sustain itself. Jung wrote in the Red Book, "There is only one way, and that is your way. Let each one go his own way. May each one fulfill his own path." This path is uncomfortable. It is lonely in certain parts. It irritates the people around you, who would prefer the manageable version of you. It demands that you face parts of yourself that have spent decades in the shadow, but it is the only path that leads anywhere real. Everything else is just a more elaborate version of the same prison. The door is open. It always has been. The only question is, are you ready to walk out?